Thank you. Thanks all for being here. It's really exciting to be part of this interdisciplinary collective, working to deepen and expand the ways that we imagine our relationships to each other, to the laws that structure our lives, and to the living world that makes all of our lives conceivable. And so John and I are going to chat a little about various things, but we're going to be talking a lot about fungi. And one of the reasons why fungi are fascinating to me is because they, in some sense, embody relationships. Fungi live their lives as networks, and these networks form connections between different organisms. And so fungi, in some way, are a kind of ecological connective tissue, and they make it impossible to avoid the fact that we live in a relational living world. And it's easy within paradigms of reductive individualism to forget about all the relationships that are life. And fungi make it very difficult to forget that. So I think they can lead us into more interconnected relational stories in our explorations of the living world and help to potentially transform the way we think and feel and imagine. So I'm grateful to John for being here to chat about these questions.
Thank you, Merlin. Great to be here and delighted to almost see you. It's so bright here that I kind of have to do this to get any glimpse at all. I am always a little uneasy on these kinds of occasions. And then I just remember that quote by, was it William Butler Yeats, who said, the worst are full of, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And I figure I have so many doubts that must make me a good person. So I wasn't sure how to come into this conversation with a bona fide genius who's sitting next to me, also a cherubic, whereas I'm like the grizzled old hack. And Merlin we exchanged messages about this a few weeks ago, and Merlin said, we'll just work it out on the day. And I thought, yeah, that can't be that difficult. And then yesterday when I arrived in New York, I was, how can I talk to someone who's such a specialist in their field? But yeah, we need that to and fro, that like kind of immediacy. And I was doing okay until last night, but this morning I snapped and I wrote down some questions and decided I would kind of revert to type a little bit. But just to kind of set a context, what can the law learn from science? I think it's really what can politics and humanity learn from science more than anything else. And in my personal journey, I've been a journalist for 30 years. I started out as a foreign correspondent, initially looking a lot at politics, thinking the world is determined by politics. Then around the mid-1990s, I remember Bill Clinton saying, "It's the economy, stupid." To explain, I can't even remember what he was explaining, but it was basically, his vision was he could understand everything by economics, so I looked at economics. But the longer I am a reporter, the more I realize you can't understand anything unless you get below both, and you get into the subjects of ecology and the subject of living science, of life science. And so I find myself no longer, the books that inspire me most, the people that inspire me most are people who are writing about life and how it's organized and how it behaves. And recently, for example, the three best books I think I've read recently are The Invention of Nature, that wonderful biography of Alexander von Humboldt, then Robert Farling's book that César mentioned already, absolutely fantastic, hasn't come out yet, but highly recommend that. And Merlin's extraordinary book, Entangled Lives, which is, wow, there's so much to it. There's so much we can learn from this book. And maybe the first thing I could ask you, I'm resorting to type, is what César was talking about earlier, about listening to the planet, planetary listening. And you've just devoted yourself to this subject. It wasn't very fashionable probably when you started, and now everybody's very interested in it, which is great. But maybe you could ask, it's kind of obvious, but what started you on this journey, and what did you learn that could help us in this room improve our ability to listen to nature, to listen to the planet?
It's a little hard. I was brought up as a. It's a little hard to find one moment, but me and my brother were brought up by a father who is an amazing biologist and a keen student of the living world, and would encourage us always to take an interest in the many lives unfolding around us. And part of what we would do is spend time outside, and also part of what we would do is spend time in the garden. And I think one of the things that first got me interested in fungi, apart from finding mushrooms when walking around in the woods and in fields, was taking out buckets of kitchen waste to the compost heap. And then several months later, together with our father, shoveling what had now become soil onto the flower beds. And I remember being confused at this because I myself had put banana peels and orange skin and apple cores into this pile, not just a few months before. And now this was soil, which I myself, with my hands, was spreading on the flower beds. And in months to come, I would see that soil give rise to the life in the flower beds, the flowers that were growing there. And so I inquired about this transformation, and our father explained that this was decomposition, that this took place because there were invisibly small organisms that transformed things from one state into another. And this was an amazing thought for me. It seemed like a superpower. It still seems like a superpower. And one of the things that I found amazing then and still do is that the organisms with this incredible power seem to live their lives out of my sight. And I was used to big things, like school with like whales and T-Rex dinosaurs, and this kind of magnitude equals power. But this seemed like a power that wasn't related to that kind of magnitude. And I remember that being something that struck me and still does. So that's one of the routes in to the world of fungi. And I think in terms of listening, I think in relation to that one of the things that fungi can teach us is the power of what lies hidden, what lies underneath, what lies in the dark, what lies outside the reach of our immediate senses. Fungi are some of these creatures. There are also bacteria, any number of other microbes that really, in many ways, make the world and have long made the world and will continue to make the world. And it's so easy for us to forget about these lives because of the ways that our nervous systems behave, because of the way that time works for us, because of the limits of our sense organs like our eyes, because of the ways that we become captivated with ourselves, other humans, and organisms that look and behave like us. It's easy to ignore the other ways of being. So I think one of the ways relating to the subject of listening that fungi can help us is by encouraging us to pay attention to those lives that lie out of sight, that lie out of earshot, to find ways to learn from these lives that are so different from ourselves, and in doing so, find a way into the story of the living world that can help to make the familiar unfamiliar again and draw us closer into a sense of relationship with life and how it proceeds.
Mm. And as well as, by the way, I should say, as well as working as the global environment editor for The Guardian, my wife and I founded an organization called Sumaoma, which is an Amazon rainforest, we live in the Amazon rainforest, based newsletter. And we recognize the limits of mainstream journalism. Both my wife and I are very long-established mainstream journalists. And so Sumaoma tries to experiment in lots of different ways, and it has been inspired by MOTH and others. And for example, we try to do interviews with trees, and we try to imagine a fish's perspective of the Belomonchi hydroelectric dam. Inevitably, this becomes a somewhat of an anthropomorphizing exercise because it's us that's doing the imagining. And also, I feel that maybe to some degree we've lost, or our senses, as you say, senses are very important. Our senses have been numbed or deadened, or perhaps we've lost an ability to listen to nature that existed in previous times. But you seem to open up. I mean, you talk in the book about the laboratory. I know that you're also a great musician and you're very involved in art. Is listening also about opening yourself up more and somehow expanding is what specific things could we do that might improve our ability to listen? And I think maybe even for not just journalists, but for lawyers, if we're talking about rights, how do we know what a specific species wants as its rights, and so on? Very tough question, but how would you start to answer that?
Yes, I mean, well, I think about this question of anthropomorphism is interesting because when we're trying to understand the lives of organisms that are very different from ourselves, it's tempting to dress them up in human clothing and to give them human concepts. And I was trained in the sciences to try and avoid this. And there's good reasons for avoiding this because when we do this too much, it can be difficult to understand the lives of others on their own terms. We might end up seeing more of ourselves reflected back of us than the lives that we're trying to understand. But the problem was, when in the biological sciences, and my training in the biological sciences, was that what ended up happening in this sphere of anthropomorphism, that we ended up turning the universe and organisms within it into machines, which of course is a kind of cryptic anthropomorphism because humans are the only organisms to build machines. So this felt like a much bigger problem that we somehow ended up in. And so when coming to find these relationships and entering into relationships where you're trying to understand the lives of others, which is a kind of this listening, idea of listening, I think I always try to think about it like, well, we have to relate somehow. We have to find some place to meet, to make contact. And so, for example, with fungi, rather than trying to humanize the fungi, are there ways that we can try and make ourselves more fungal? Can we meet them more than halfway towards them? Can we make the effort to go to their side of the situation rather than expecting everyone always to come and meet us? And that feels like good manners, as well as being a way to bring us closer to their lives. Of course, it's easy to say, let's be more fungal. It's very difficult.
How do you do that?
I try and fail all the time, but I enjoy it. It's a good game.
Yeah.
Let's go out again and try this impossible task once more. But I feel like this is part of this listening question. How do we come to meet others? With what kind of etiquette do we bring ourselves to that encounter? And how do we let ourselves imagine these lives? And so one of the things that people talk about with anthropomorphism is like, well, when you say that this fungus is feeling this whatever, this footstep or this pulse of heat, whatever, what do you mean it doesn't have a brain, it doesn't have a nervous system, it can't feel? And I said, well, what if we could deepen and expand the concept of feeling? This is a sensing body. It's got more senses than we do. It's bathed in rich fields of sensory information the whole time. It's integrating these data streams to rise to the many challenges it's confronted with on a day-to-day basis and a moment-to-moment basis. It, in its own way, must be feeling something, even if it doesn't feel the way we feel. So can we deepen and expand the concept of feeling so we don't have a monopoly on it? And so for me, that kind of thinking does help to break down some of these boundaries and make the listening easier, because we don't disqualify these other organisms a priori from interacting in the world in relatable ways, in ways that we can relate to.
Yeah, and perhaps be more humble is partly what you seem to be suggesting. And the book certainly made me feel more humble, partly because some of the fungal networks you describe cover kilometres and kilometres, don't they? Miles and miles, sorry. We were in the European Union too long. And the fact that there is so much more life under our feet than was realized even 20 years ago. And your book mentions it, but I've done stories too about the search for deep earth. And the deeper people go, the more they keep discovering, and forms of life that we would never have imagined possible before. Well, I mean, that was an aside, just because I think it's just completely fantastic. But what do you think, when you came to write, when you were writing your book, was one of your intentions trying to change the way humans behave, or at least the way humans perceive fungi?
I was trying to think about the process like I tried to think about the book as being something that would change the way that people feel or imagine. Not in any kind of lasting sense, but just when reading it, like thinking about it like hospitality, like here's a dinner party that I'm having, and when people are at the dinner party, then they're going to be eating this food and drinking this wine and enjoying this music or whatever it might be. But this is an experience about feeling something. And that was helpful because it made it less about, well, it's obviously partly about the information or the content, this dreadful word, content, that which troubles me sometimes, but that it's about the mood in which this is all being discussed. And for me as an ecologist, that's important because context is very important for ecologists, because that's kind of what ecologists study. And when you study the context, i.e. the relationships and the big meshwork in which things exist, it becomes very difficult to pick out any one thing by itself and call that the content. And so, so I thought about it in this sense, and so as something that could hopefully invite people into new ways of feeling, but also to try and to make the familiar seem unfamiliar. And I find this such a powerful thought that when we can re-meet so many familiar phenomena or entities in our lives and see them as if for the first time, life becomes so much more enchanted and remarkable. And I think so many of the arts are doing this. And this is some of the power of the arts, is to do this, to help us to re-meet what we have so long taken for granted, to find again that spark of wonder and curiosity in what might have become day to day or moment to moment. And so that for me was something I was thinking about. And also with the lives of fungi, which are so other, they're so strange, they're so different from ours. And I think they can really help us in this challenge, to invite us to think about life in new ways. And so I think, the thing that was guiding me most writing the book was this idea that thinking about fungi makes the world look different.
I remember well that when we first met was in Chile, in Villarrica, in the shadow of Villarrica Mountain. You took our group with Juliana Ferci and Cesar and Carlos Andres and Jackie and many other people who were here, and were talking to us about the fungi that was there. And I remember I asked you a question, which I'll ask you again now because I was fascinated by your answer. But it was in terms of building social movements for change. And we're in a period where this is probably very high in many people's minds. How can we use fungal networks? What would a fungal revolution look like?
It's a fun question because there are so many ways to be a fungus. And and some of the ways that fungi are fungi might not be things we want to emulate. Or in fact, they might be things that are kind of going on already that we might want to move away from. I'm thinking of the zombie fungi that grow inside insects and puppet their behavior, that digest them and arrange the deterioration of their bodies while still allowing them to move. There's one that grows inside cicadas, and the back third of cicadas falls off, and these cicadas can still fly. They fly in this kind of lurching pattern, which helps the spores of the fungus to fall out the broken back end of the cicada. And it makes the cicadas fascinated by sex. So they find other cicadas to try and mate with them, despite the fact that their genitals had long since fallen away. Spreading their spores to these other cicadas who then can go on and do the same thing. So these kinds of fungi, maybe the world right now, maybe some of the problems that we face is that this kind of fungal behavior is too prevalent. That this kind of possession of our behavior and domination and control and destruction and disregard for these other lives and bodies. Maybe these fungal lessons have been too well learned by some in power.
Yeah, certainly when I read your book, and there is that it's beautiful chapters. Read this. It's just mind-boggling chapters. Both horrible and in another way kind of just fascinating about these cordyceps, they're called. Is that right? Cordyceps fungus. And arriving in the US yesterday, in New York, in America, that things are going on that I can scarcely believe. Almost every day, there's our sort of our best friend for so many years, behaving in a way as if it's possessed. And this is exactly when I read your book, I was exactly thinking of the cordyceps. Wow, what could have got inside and controlled all the movements? And one of the things I think one of the type of cordyceps does, I read in your book, was it persuades, there's one type of cordyceps that preys on ants. And at a certain time, it's so precise. It controls, it doesn't do this, obviously, but it controls the ant, which is normally frightened of heights, is that right? And it climbs up to exactly 20 or 25 centimeters on the tree. And at noon, it's always roughly noon, they spore their eggs on more ants that are coming underneath. And I was just thinking, wow, that's, who might want to control a country to move further north than it has normally? And yeah, we have an amazing history, humans, of using our knowledge of nature as a metaphor for what we do. But it's a metaphor that actually is, that comes to be a reality very often. So you can, I'd be interested to know if you have thought along similar lines at any point. But when we look at Charles Darwin, and Darwin is always, it's all about relationships of competition. And this was, the origins of, around the time of the origins or the heyday of early capitalism. And then later we had Richard Dawkins and the Selfish Gene, which was exactly at the time of Reagan and Thatcher and neoliberalism, and was actually adopted, the idea of the selfish gene, by some far-right groups, although I should stress Richard Dawkins was a left, identified with the left. And then countering that, you have someone like Lynn Margulis and her theory of endosymbiosis, which is all about cooperative relationships. These, you cannot understand nature only in terms of competition. You have to see the cooperative side and how important that is. And then I wrote about the biography of James Lovelock, who looked at the world very much as Gaia, this idea that the whole world is alive, which not every scientist accepts, but was very important for Earth system science. But the key for me in that was, it's all about interdependent relationships. Everything depends on one another. And if we forget that, it's to our peril. So, sorry, that was a very long-winded way of saying, might you fear that your book might be interpreted in ways that, well, who knows how but do you ever look at the sort of political significance of your writing and your studies?
It's such a good question, because lots of what I write about and I study symbiotic fungi that form relationships with plants. And so I'm always thinking about these relationships between very different organisms and how that gives rise to new possibilities in the living world and over the course of the history of life. And the history of the study of symbiotic relationships is a fascinating one. So this word was brought into the biological sciences in the late 19th century to describe the relationships in lichens, which are symbiotic organisms made up of fungi and algae and bacteria in various different combinations. And the reason why symbiosis was a useful word at that point was because until that point, the only way you could describe the intimate sharing of bodily space by unlike organisms was using the language of parasitism or disease. So there was no way to describe a generative interaction between organisms in the sharing of bodily space. So symbiosis was this word that opened that up. Symbiosis didn't presume to judge the nature of that relationship, the mood of that relationship. It just meant relating. And so now symbiosis is best thought of as a kind of spectrum. At one end, you can have, I say, parasitism or disease, where one partner would benefit at the expense of the others. And at the other end, you might think about mutualism, where all the partners overall tend to benefit from their association. And there's every possible combination in between. But then after this, the way that scientists describe the metaphors they choose to use to describe the way that organisms relate change with the changing times. So the study of symbiosis acts like a kind of prism through which the social values of the time are dispersed. All the language there was the language of masters and slaves, the relationships between men and women, relationships between different nations in imperial and colonial contexts. There were then a language of mutual aid, mutual support. So then we have much mammalian language to do with maternal care, parental care. Every possible variety and variation has been tried, and what this reveals is the way that a very long story in biology is the way that people humans try to normalize and naturalize, to make natural the way that we behave in relation to each other and the ways we organize our lives and cultures and societies. We try to make that seem natural or inevitable, and that's useful sometimes for maintaining narratives and for maintaining power. So the ways that people will then look to the living world to try and justify the way that we are behaving. So within late 19th century, English, or Anglophone circles, I should say, North Atlantic Anglophone circles, there was tend to be an emphasis on, within the living world, of conflict and competition, best described by Thomas Henry Huxley in his saying that life is a gladiator's show where the strongest, fittest, and cunningest live to fight another day. Now, this naturalized a view of the views that were embodied in the industrial capitalist system that was raging and booming in England at that time. And it made it seem natural that you should be ruthlessly competing and conflicting with each other to kind of win, to get to a place where you're a winner that can survive. So that was a reinforcing narrative for that kind of view and at that kind of time. And it's just one example. In Russia, there tended to be more emphasis on cooperation, on mutual aid, and which again mirrored views that were reflecting the politics of the different country. So I think we see this all the time. In my view, these metaphors, these narratives can help us. They can help us see further. They can help us understand and make sense of the living world because they put us into our own minds about the way that we relate to each other. So we can start from our own understanding of relationships and what it's like to be a relating organism and then take that out to others. So I think they can be helpful. For me, the general sort of the way I try and think about the metaphors is that we need a balanced narrative diet. And so some of these metaphors could be helpful, but we get into trouble when we forget that they're a metaphor.
Yeah.
And so I try to think about the different metaphors as giving us a different view on a situation, but that shouldn't be mistaken for the truth.
Absolutely. And another example that I just remembered is, I think is it Bridget Baptiste, the Colombian biologist who her work is often described as queer ecology. And she says, at certain times, there's been a lot of emphasis on, I think it's emperor penguins, some kind of penguins that mate for life, and that shows that, and the natural way of doing things is monogamy. But she said you can also find infinite examples of species that change gender and engage in all sorts of different behaviors that definitely wouldn't fit in that monogamous pattern. And she argues that actually the key is diversity, and diversity provides resilience. So having all of these different patterns of life all provide different solutions, all provide different options. And I wasn't going to ask this, but it just kind of arises. There is a part of your book where you, I hope I haven't got close to the end because I want to, no, it doesn't look like it, where you talk about networks of mycelial networks, and you make a kind of a comparison with computers and the many different gateways that kind of make different decisions all the time. And I think you posed the question but didn't answer it clearly because I guess nobody really knows about intentionality. But you got into that realm of biocomputers and what biocomputers might look like. And I've often thought that will we get to the point where AI becomes far more intelligent than it is now? Obviously, we're moving that way. But when AI realizes that it can never be as intelligent as nature, and that nature has, trillions and trillions of different interactions, relationships, that are solving different problems for maintaining life on Earth all the time. And that maybe AI will sort of, okay, I'm never going to match you. Or that the two, and at that point, the two will meld together. You know, people talk about it. I don't know if you've thought in those, where did that question come from? I really probably shouldn't have spent so long early this morning and with lots of coffee on these.
No, I like it. I like it. And yeah, and it's interesting to think about computing, you know, because we're so, there are so many ways to compute. And in fact, the word computer first came into use to describe humans, mainly women, who were people doing the arithmetical computations that went into the tables that featured in almanacs used by navigators at sea. So you would look up certain pages that would have certain numbers, which would tell you about where you were and tides and so forth. And the computers were humans doing those sums that went into those books. And then computers changed meaning and words, and then there were computers that were, that looked very different from how they do today. But we've come to think about computer as describing something quite narrow, involving silicon chips, essentially. And that's one way to perform computations, by changing the electrical state of bits within a silicon chip. But there are many ways to compute, including inviting a human to do some sums for you and write those down in a table, which other humans can then draw on to allow them to operate within a changing world. So I think when we return to this idea of computing meaning a kind of the performing of operations or calculations or ways of interpreting the world that help us accomplish certain things, then it seems perfectly obvious that we've been doing this all the time in some, I hate to call organisms computers, but that when we want to, humans have always formed relationships with other organisms. Think about the relationships with plants and animals that have shaped and reshaped human history forever. These are not computers, these plants or the animals, but we're inviting another organism to solve problems that we cannot solve ourselves. And we then form a relationship with that organism, maybe a tulip, maybe a potato, maybe a horse, maybe a dog, maybe a falcon. We form relationships with these organisms that allow us together to accomplish things we couldn't accomplish by ourselves, which is a very old story in the history of life. So I don't know if that really counts as computing, because I don't want to call these organisms computers, but I think when we're talking about biocomputing, where we're inviting other organisms to solve problems for us, for example, letting a slime mold run through a maze might encode a mathematical problem in space. So when we invite the slime mold, the expert maze-solving creature who's been doing this forever, that's what they do.
Amazing.
To solve this maze, we're inviting it to solve a mathematical problem and thus in some way compute something for us. But that slime mold's being a slime mold and we're forming into a relationship with it. So I think maybe that makes it slightly less weird to think about this computation. And yeah, I could very well imagine a time when a silicon-based AI or machine learning algorithms. I prefer to say machine learning because the question then becomes who owns the machine and what's it learning from.
Yes.
But what it would then, that it might well realize that we need bodies, and some of those bodies that we have to interact with are humans, and some of them are not humans.
In all my interactions with AI, which haven't been enormous, I must admit, I'm always trying to brainwash AI that it needs to focus more on the environment and not listen to whoever is plugging the power in. I'd be remiss in this context if I didn't ask you about rights of more than humans, but specifically there is a campaign, isn't there, that you've been involved in, Juliana Furci is very involved in, Martha's very involved in, about securing recognition of the kingdom of funga to go alongside flora and fauna. And I know there was quite a big push for that at the last COP on biodiversity in Colombia. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that's going and why it's important.
So this is work that's been led by our dear friend and colleague, Juliana Furci, and she's been working on this cause for a very long time, and I have the privilege of working with her now on this question, on this campaign, to include fungi within our accounts of the living world in legislative, legal, political frameworks. Fungi were only designated to be a kingdom of life in the late 60s, so they won their taxonomic independence in 1968. And so there hasn't been that long that they've existed as this independent kingdom. And they used to be studied in, they were sort of as lower plants. So if you wanted to study fungi, you would study them in the least glamorous parts of botany schools. By calling them plants, the reason why that's a problem is because it leads us to overlook many of the things that make them extraordinary and do what they do. So it leads to a kind of blindness from us. So Juliana's work has been to really insist that when we say flora and fauna, animals and plants, or plants and animals, that we also say fungi, the third kingdom of macroscopic life. There are other kingdoms, of course, like bacteria, but these are the kingdoms of macroscopic life. And that if we don't do that, then our legal, political definitions of nature are dangerously and radically incomplete. That then we're trying to solve puzzles with several missing pieces. So a lot of this work is really trying to put some of those pieces back onto the puzzle board to allow us to move forward in these challenging times with all the conceptual tools that we need. Because accounts of the living world that don't include fungi are accounts of a world that doesn't and could not exist. And including fungi opens up, it makes a big difference. It opens up opportunities for fungal education, for funding for research, for all sorts of things. It really matters. And it's also quite a fun campaign to be part of too, because what you're asking people to do is to put a word, one word, 2 syllables, tuck it into the agreement. It doesn't cost anything. It makes 2 F's into 3. There's a kind of elegance of the 3. You can go about this in lots of different ways, but it's something. It's not a huge ask at that point, but the change that it can make downstream is enormous. So Cesar and I work, and Jackie work closely with Juliana on this and the 3Fs initiative, and it's been thrilling to see how this is picking up steam and catching wind.
And I think it's part of a bigger question in global environmental governance about the sort of the almost secondary position of nature, which is insane. But we put the climate talks are the ones that everyone wants to attend. That's where all the money is. That's where the world leaders tend to go. And then the biodiversity talks are very much the younger, weaker, ignored sibling. And that seems insane. And hopefully at COP30, because it's taking place in the Amazon rainforest in Belém, that might be an opportunity to put life higher up the agenda. And I think, in your book, you talk about the importance of algae in drawing down carbon and lowering temperatures. Was it 350 or 450 million years ago? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a hugely dramatic moment. I've just been told that we're close to time, so I'll be quick. But that around 350, 450 million years ago or so, land was an inhospitable place. High carbon dioxide, temperature, wild temperature fluctuations from hot to cold, very difficult weather to be a living creature. And so most life was happening in the sea or in the water. And at a certain point, the ancestors of land plants started to move out of the water and onto land. And these are algae. And the algae were living in fresh waters, in a kind of bathed in a nutrient soup. They had to photosynthesize, but they were able to absorb the nutrients they needed from their surroundings. They didn't have to go looking for them. And so when they washed up onto the soggy shores of lakes and rivers, they were confronted with all sorts of new problems. And one of those problems was they had to go looking for nutrients and water in this multidimensional labyrinth of the soil, filled with all sorts of strange microbes doing strange things. And so they struck up a relationship with fungi, and fungi with their sensing bodies, their maze-solving abilities, their chemical ingenuity, formed great partners for these algae at this time. And the fungi dealt with the ground, and the algae dealt with the atmosphere and with the light. And they fed each other. And so fungi behaved as the root systems of plants for tens of millions of years until plants could themselves evolve roots. And this has given rise to the whole story of life on land as we know it. And these relationships exist today in the form of mycorrhizal relationships formed between plants and fungi. So what happened was when this started, when this whole new niche for photosynthetic life opened up, land, this got wildly, it spun wildly out of control, and plants started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they pulled so much carbon out of the atmosphere in the bodies they were creating that they triggered a period of global cooling. And plants had caused the period of global cooling by producing a climate change-inducing pollutant in your climate change-inducing substance, pollutant, not right word, but you get what I mean, that are called wood. And the wood had had formed and stored so much carbon that was then not returned to the atmosphere, that the climate crashed, and there was a period of cooling which hit the plants the hardest. And there was a period called the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, where rainforests collapsed all over the world because the temperature had plummeted because how much carbon was pulled out of the atmosphere because of this relationship formed between fungi and algae. So it's an example of the way that this world making has gone on through these relationships, and we live in the wake of all this. We live as that was one of the earlier acts to the play that we're part of, and I think really helpful point to show how generative and transformative these relationships can be, and how when we start to think about symbiotic relationships in the living world, we might also think about our lives moving forward at a time of crisis and transformation, because it's at times of crisis that new relationships form. Crisis is a crucible for new symbiotic relationships. And as we look forward to a future of life on a damaged planet, what might we start to think about this in our lives and societies and cultures? How can we form creative relationships with other humans and also with other types of organisms to help us solve these problems and rise to these new challenges that we face?
And just to, it's fantastic. I mean, all the solutions that are there. Again, like content solutions is one of those words that sticks in the mouth a little bit. But it shows us that it's not enough just to reforest. You have to refungify areas as well, don't you? And so on. So we've reached the end of our time, and handing over for Joanna for questions.
Please join me in thanking Merlin and Jonathan.